Well, hello everybody. I'm going to be reading quite a few quotes because I've done a lot of work on this and other people say things better than I do, so I've put them on slides. So, good evening ladies and gentlemen and any hybrids amongst you. You've got to be very careful what you say these days because of identity politics. If you want to know my preferred pronoun, if people ask me, I say it's a malfunctioning wardrobe. So, I'm going to be talking quite a bit, but at the end I hope there'll be time for questions. So this is about the rise and fall of civilisations, and I'd like you to think about what this might mean for us now, what stage we're in. Now, this is just to express some of the madness that's going on at the moment. My daily tonic, Matt. Now, Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, had a quote, "There exists in..." I'll read these out because some of you might not be able to read them. "There exists in human nature a strong propensity to deprecate the advantages and to magnify the evils of the present times." And this is true. I hope anything I say that might sound a bit negative isn't destroyed by... or it doesn't destroy the fact that I appreciate that we're alive now and we've got heating, food, travel possibilities, all those wonderful things. So I'm not knocking the present, but it might sound as if I am sometimes. Now, everybody can see when a coronation takes place or can write down the results of a battle, but a change in the philosophy of the learned class, a loss of religious faith in the majority of a nation, which are revolutions that prescribe the course of affairs for centuries to come, not everyone can see. And that was said by Emerson. Now, I really enjoy anything to do with history. I always have done. And I was very pleased to find I was living next to an eminent historian, Oswin, who you all know, of course, and Penny, I think, is also a bit of a historian. But the thing about looking at history and reading about history and thinking about it is it gives a context for today. And things are so confusing for us today now, it's so rapidly changing. You need to put it in context, or we all do. So every age and culture has derived something from its predecessors, adds some contribution of its own, particular characteristics, skills and qualities, and passes them on to its successors. So history is not usually what has happened. History is what some people have thought to be significant. Always that's true. One of the interesting things about history is you can't get in the minds of the people who are long since dead. You don't really know what they were thinking or feeling or experiencing. But we can put together as much as we can. And that's what we try and do. This is a law of humankind that has never been negated. Whatever power seems dominant now will pass away, and this is true. And we'll see that in the passing of all kinds of things. Human beings are very adaptable. For example, for a long time we used to drive on the left-hand side of the road, but now we just drive on what's left of the road because of all the potholes. Human adaptability. So we've existed in all kinds of climates, environments, jungles, deserts, tundra, forests, and we've adapted to them and lived in them and survived them. And that makes me think that the fuss that's being made about 1 or 2 degrees extra warming, when we're coming out of a mini ice age, which we are, is a bit over the top. We survived all those different temperatures, climates, and environments. Now this is a pattern, I don't know if you can see it, but those of you that have been to a house will know it's hanging up in our hallway. It's by Ensor Holiday. And the human brain is a pattern-matching organ. That's what we do all the time. We try and make sense of things. We're looking for patterns to see if something stands out as different from what we're expecting. And if it is different, it might be a threat, or it might be something we're really, really keen to know about, and it reassures us because it's familiar. But the thing about standing in front of this is almost a meditation, really, because you start to see different ways of looking at it to make a pattern out of it. But the moment you think you've got it, it tricks you into looking somewhere else. I don't know if some of you can see that on there. This is, I'm afraid, it's a bit too bright. But now, I went to school. I didn't enjoy school very much, but I did like the history lessons. And the reasons I liked them was that we had a history teacher who would tell us about history, not in just little blocks, like the Egyptians and the Nazis and the Romans and all that stuff. He sort of gave a sweep of history. And he started with the Stone Age. And that got me interested in history, really, and started me reading things. And he even mentioned Neanderthals. And the only photograph I could find of the last remaining Neanderthals in Europe was this. And if you believe that... Now, human beings have always had an itch to dominate nature. In a way, from the moment we're born, nature is trying to kill us off. He not busy being born is busy dying, as the saying goes. And that's true for all of us. Life is hard, and it has always been hard. This is a painting from the Chevet Caves in the Ardèche Valley. And there's a story about that, but I better not tell it. Just underneath where that cave is, Phonic broke 4 ribs on a river. And yes. So there's this itch to dominate nature, using superstition, using practical methods of improving agriculture and so on. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it's 6,000 odd years older than Stonehenge, but it's got these T-shaped, what do you call them? I'm looking towards me. Yes, obelisks will do, thank you. And they've got patterns and designs on them. And it's very old, about 11,000, 12,000 years ago. And they've even started finding, that's what an artist reckoned it must have looked like when they were building it. But of course they don't know exactly how they did it or why they did it. But they've found other places now nearby that are even older. Wonkatlu Tala predates Göbekli Tepe by 1,000 years, which is amazing. And they found all these beautiful objects there. And that also had these obelisks that you can see down there. Now, there's always been people interested in what makes humanity tick. What are the power plays in society, the desires and passions of people in society? And Lao-Tzu, 2,600 years ago, he described some of these. He said, for example, the more restrictions and prohibitions there are in the world, the poorer the people. The more civilized instruments the people possess, the more confusion reigns in the land. The more skills and crafts the people have, the more bizarre and useless objects will be produced. That's certainly the case, isn't it? The more laws and regulations are promulgated, the more thieves and robbers there will be. He also pointed out that those who are right don't argue, and those who argue are not right, which I rather liked. And then we come to Ibn Khaldun, who's really the father of modern historical research in sociology and economics and all sorts of things. He was born in Tunis in 1332, and he studied in Spain and Fez and Cairo and various other places. And he was author of the Muqaddimah, which I was advised to read by a good friend of mine, and she's dead now, Doris Lessing, and she said, you must read it. So I did read it, and it's unputdownable. The insights in it are just astonishing. For those of you that are interested in history and sociology and psychology and so on. And I've got a few quotes from him. This is a very straightforward one, I suppose. The past resembles the future more than one drop of water resembles another. In other words, well, no, you know what that means. Prejudice and partnership obscure the critical faculty and preclude critical investigation. The result is that falsehoods are accepted and transmitted. He was just looking. He worked with all different sultans and tribes and politicians, and he just started noticing these things, and he had the perception and the ability to make something of this and put them in his work, in his writings. Throughout history, many nations have suffered a physical defeat, but that has never marked the end of a nation. But when a nation is a victim of a psychological defeat, then that marks the end of a nation. And of course, I hope some of you can see that that's relevant to today. Khaldun believed the rise and fall to be inevitable because once prosperous citizens become self-centred, pleasure-seeking and unwilling to make the sacrifices that a group requires to fend off others, fragmentation ensues and a society is easily taken over by a more cohesive force. He had this idea, John, what's it called? Asabai, I think it's called, which is an Arabic word meaning a sort of zealous group togetherness. And you can see this in the Middle East now, but you can see it everywhere, really. When people gather together and form a sort of cult or belief system, they have this, or a religion indeed. If they're very passionate about it, they have that sort of belief in them. And he noticed this all over North Africa and Spain and Morocco and so on. The phases of the moon. There are phases in human life too, aren't there? I won't tell you what end I am, but I'll just give you a hint. I'm this end, I think. The rise and fall of civilizations is rather like the cycle of the seasons, winter, spring, summer, and the autumn that gives us a harvest. But what's the harvest? Well, hopefully, it's the subsequent long-term refinement of humanity as the next civilizations arise after ours. So there's a lot of different civilizations, and so too many to count really, but here's just a few. The Assyrians, the Egyptians, I've just been, the Minoan, and all these civilizations arose at times when there was warming in the earth, and crops would grow. There was a greening going on, and the Minoan is an example of that. And the Greek also. That's Roman amphitheatre in Amman. And I remember once sitting at the top of that, and you could hear a lecture going on to a group of tourists by a lecturer right down in that place down there. That he was standing about there with about 10 tourists. And I could hear every single word he and they were saying from right up the top. It's amazing. And these amphitheatres were all over the place. There's Veronique there, and a little one we saw in the south of Turkey. All these other civilizations. Some of you will have been to some of these. Who's been to see the terracotta armies? I bet somebody here has. Yes, there you are. Hindu, Christian. Again, these Christian cathedrals were built in the medieval warming period because you need warmth for crops to grow. And when it's cold, they don't grow. In fact, a lot of the collapses of civilizations have come about because of cooling. An interesting thing is that I saw a little documentary a few years ago. The old kingdom of Egypt, which is an amazing time, but it came to an end suddenly, and the Nile dried up. It didn't dry up because of a drought. Well, it was a drought, but it dried up because all the ice that had been forming in other parts, the North Pole, the South Pole, and glaciation and so on, the mountain regions, just wasn't allowing enough rain to fall to fill the Nile. And there's some quite grim writings, hieroglyphic writings in some of the tombs there, saying that people got so desperate, some of them started cannibalism, eating children and things like that, dead children. Horrible. But that was what happened in a global cooling. It lasted for about 100 years. And that's in ancient Egypt, before the new kingdom started up. I just love that symbol at the top there, that amazing pattern, the oscillations. And then, of course, we've got the British Empire, and there's been a fashion lately to knock it and say that, we were colonialists and going around doing all sorts of terrible things. We did do some terrible things, but all empires have massacred and killed people from time to time. But we did an awful lot of good. We introduced better transport, better health, better education, legal systems into countries all over the place. So we shouldn't be ashamed of our empire, although some people pretend they are now. Now, some of you can remember the time when milk bottles were broken into by hooligan blue tits. So what is a civilization? Well, it's said to be any advanced state of human society where access to cheap energy allows law and order to arise and a high level of culture, science, industry and government to begin, where progress in agriculture, science and technology can exist together with a refinement of thought and cultural appreciation, and giving new opportunities for trade in ideas, modern comforts and conveniences. One of the most important things to remember is that you can't have a civilization without cheap energy. And in the early days for humanity, it was chopping down forests and burning wood to keep themselves warm, to cook and to build from. So cheap energy is really essential. Now our energy is now getting very expensive, and that's a sign that we've run out of sources of cheap energy. It's a bit worrying, really. I can tell there's a few cat lovers in the room. But here's somebody who I've interviewed and spoke to a few times. Jim Penman wrote a book called Biohistory, which I found very interesting. And he had an idea, which I think has got a lot of merit personally, is that behavioural changes in the face of hunger generated a series of hormonal and epigenetic developments that adapted people to a food-limited environment, enabling them to make the most efficient use of resources. And he did a lot of research on this. He's a multi-millionaire, an Australian, but he was passionately interested in these ideas. And he's made a series of sort of little videos that you can watch on YouTube about this if you just Google biohistory. So he said, we evolved as a herd animal. Well, obviously that's a given. We are a herd animal. The same patterns of human group behaviour have been repeatedly observed throughout the ages and across all cultures, including ours. And all the knowledge that people were looking for in those times is directed at solving problems. That's what knowledge is about. It's about solving problems, understanding. So herd behaviour appeared when people banded together in groups and in order to survive, shared beliefs and ideas about what to do to overcome problems and thus improve their survival chances. Disciplining toddlers, he thought, and young children play a healthy role in human development because children have an innate need for clear, reliable boundaries to guide their behaviour. Now, talking to a friend or two who had a lot of experience in the Middle East, they said people in the Middle East absolutely mollycoddle their children. They don't discipline them, and then they start disciplining them really quite harshly when they get to their teens. And that is a danger because, according to Penman, these characteristics tend to arise from firmly controlling toddlers' behaviour. They include independent thinking, if you do that, fine motor skills, hereditary loyalties, and preference for rulers who are similar to them in language and culture. They're more likely to value individual honesty and loyalty over abstract ideology, such as those embedded in rigid institutions like the rule of law and authoritarian religious structures. These, in turn, produce traits which, taken collectively, adapted us to the requirements of civilization. So self-discipline, delayed breeding, you don't start breeding until you're married and got an income and all the rest of it. Monogamy, shared childcare, delayed gratification, greater cooperation between groups within the culture, and intolerance of outsiders who might threaten the food supply. And he's looking back into, thousands of years, but only when society is relatively stable do people have time to think, reflect, and ask meaningful questions about our origin and purpose. How they grow? Well, rituals and institutions build up. They develop to maintain this state, cultural practice that mimic the physiological effects of hunger, and thus delay breeding arose, like, for example, the habit of fasting, or the habit of marriage and the rituals around marriage. Penman suggests that we evolved so we could continue to act and think like hungry primates, even when we were not actually short of food. Lawmaking, trading, technology, architecture, and the search for a more profound meaning in our lives became important. So I've just done a little diagram to describe this, really. So it's the rise and the fall. Starts off with mild hunger. If you're hungry, you want to do something to alleviate the hunger, always. And to get that satisfaction, you've got to be vigorous. You've got to go out there, you've got maybe to fight or to travel or to explore. And if you're successful, that gives you a confidence. And you can start trading and building better homes and all the things you need to do to become prosperous. Now, this is another quote from Edward Gibbon. In the end, more than freedom, they wanted security. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all. Security, comfort, and freedom. When the Athenians finally wanted not to give to society, but for society to give to them, when the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again. Diana's here, and she will recognise that. Because it was Diana that suggested we go to Patara. They've done a restoration on it now, and that's what it looks like today. And you can see an awful lot of people around there, and everybody could discuss and vote on whatever it was they were talking about. And some people say that it's to the Lycians that we owe the foundation of all democratic parliaments. That's me standing on the remains of a lighthouse there. it just fascinates me. I mean, you all experience this. You go to somewhere where there's these old ruins, and you think, gosh, there was a whole civilization here. There's all these people doing all this work, building these wonderful buildings. That is me looking up at the arch, wondering, how's it staying up? But down there is a high street. It's very long, and there's another sort of archway at the bottom. And all these little spaces there, that was shopping. They were all shops, individual shops, all the way along there. Dozens and dozens of them, from the top of the hill where that arch was, which is up here, right the way down, as far as you could see. Sedentary culture is the goal of civilization. It means the end of its lifespan and brings about its corruption, said Ibn Khaldun. When incentive to acquire and obtain property is gone, people no longer make efforts to acquire any. Those who infringe upon property rights commit an injustice. If this occurs repeatedly, all incentives to cultural enterprise are destroyed and they cease utterly to make an effort. This leads to destruction and the ruin of civilization, which seems to be going on now. There's like a deliberate campaign to destroy our civilization. In 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, said the World Economic Forum. This is an idea that they were spreading about, which is absolutely horrific. Because if you haven't got something to strive for, something to apply your mind and your efforts and your ingenuity and initiative to build up something, you're in big trouble. You know, people get depressed, they get anxious. People need to have crafts and skills and so on. And if they haven't got them, or they're taken away from them, that crashes the civilization. So that's what these dreadful people at the World Economic Forum are trying to do. So he then says, you know, people get prosperous and generate lots of wealth, but then very quickly degenerate. And you get chaos, and then you get collapse. Why do civilizations collapse? Well, Penman thinks it's because the quality of child rearing declines. And it's interesting, in the Middle East at the moment, there's all these different factions fighting one another. And if the quality of the child rearing of some of the Islamic Arab people, where they're very soft on bringing up the toddlers, but then get harsh in the teens, that lays them open to being attracted to cults. If in their early years children are overindulged and brought up without clear boundaries and then have to accept harsh discipline later, they will, as adults, more easily become prey to cult behaviour and accept brutal authoritarian rulers. And we see this in various countries at the moment. It's easier for totalitarianism to take hold when fewer children feel secure enough to explore the world, think for themselves and speak up. So civilization collapsed because a country's economic, political, military and cultural makeup is largely determined by the underlying emotional and psychological nature of its population. Governments are not the solution to problems that are biologically and emotionally driven. They just reflect the people they rule, not the other way around. We have no choice, however, do we, to live through whatever phase of the rise and fall we find ourselves in. Now, The Fate of Empires, Sir John Glubb. I know some of you have read this. He was an amazing man. I went to a couple of his talks a long time ago. He's dead now, but he had a similar pattern that sort of pattern matches a bit to Penman's. He said that people were, when they were going out as pioneers to explore, to conquer or whatever, they were vigorous, they were self-reliant and resilient. And they would go out and start an age of conquests. And they would conquest lands and peoples and tribes, conquer them. And then, once they'd done that, people started trading. So we get the age of commerce. And then, with the commerce, came wealth. So the age of affluence and complacency began. And then, they had all this money, so they started talking amongst themselves, creating universities, arguing amongst themselves, and getting very political. And thereafter you get decadence. It all starts collapsing. And so that's a very similar pattern, isn't it, to what Penman was saying. All complex systems are vulnerable to collapse. Empires and civilizations fall the same way all complex systems do, by becoming too complex to hold up their own weight. Now, when a culture is at its peak, Glubb had this, he called it the high noon phase, where everything was going really well. The culture was rich and wealthy and attracting people from all over the place. But what happens when one culture is in that high noon phase, but another one is either rising up or has already just sunk? So you get this sort of, I mean, this is obviously very stylized, you get this happening all over the world. Different cultures are at different stages in this rising and falling, in other words. Now here's another person who's a friend of mine called Ian McGilchrist, and he has a different approach to what's going on, but he's very, very keen on, you know, Glubb and other people that I'll mention in a moment. But he talks about the two sides of the brain and how one side, which is the right hemisphere, should be the master, because that's the side that can understand context and metaphor and implicit knowledge. Whereas the left hemisphere can't do that. The left hemisphere just wants to grab things, control things. It's very linear. And if the right hemisphere isn't in charge, then you've really got problems with the in the world, because the left hemisphere is a little dictator given half a chance. It just wants to control everything and have everything simplified and cut up into little chunks. So his latest work is called The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions and the Unmasking of the World. It's an absolutely phenomenal book. And I was lucky he sent it to me before it was actually published in PDFs and so on. But it's a big book. It's 2 volumes. But every page is packed with an enormous amount of wisdom and interest. If you're interested in psychology, human behaviour, and where we're going. And here's a quote from him. "We need the ability to make fine discriminations and to use reason appropriately." So the left hemisphere focuses attention. That's what it does. It focuses attention. But it can't do that without the bigger context, which comes from the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere knows what's likely to be correct and right and useful. But the left hemisphere doesn't. It just does what it wants to do. And it's very acquisitive. Very keen on power. And he says that alone they're destructive, and right now they may be bringing us close to forfeiting the civilization they helped to create. This is the left hemisphere. So, the perennial sources of conflict. Well, they're ones you'd expect. Tribalism, racism, religion, revenge, ignorance, politics, greed, power and corruption. These are the perennial sources of all types of conflict in relationships, in families, in businesses and in between countries. You can always put a label on from that list. But beneath that chaos sit the innate human physical and emotional needs of everybody. So we have physical needs, obviously. We need food, we need water, we need air, space to grow. And if we haven't got those, we suffer enormously. I mean, you know, if someone puts a plastic bag over your head and you can't breathe after a moment, you do more than panic. You're desperate. But you need food and water and space to grow also. We have emotional needs as well as the physical needs. We have a need for security. We have a need for autonomy and control. We have a need for status and privacy. We have a need for attention. We have a need to be emotionally connected to other people. And we have a need for community, like we have in this village. And we also need, our brains want to feel that they're competent and they can do things and they can achieve things. But last but not least is the need for meaning. If your life has got no meaning in it, no reason for getting up in the morning, you get depressed very quickly. When you get, with any of these needs not being met, you get anxious, depressed, and very often angry and prone to addictions. So it's a real problem. And as you can see, it's very difficult for people to live in a complex civilization like ours that is frustrating basic human needs. That's why there's such a sharp rise in mental illness over the last 20, 30 years, because life is getting too complex, and that's stopping people from getting their needs met. So, seeking to meet our innate needs is the principal motivator for all human activities. It is emotional needs that motivate our educational and career performance and drive us to build relationships, raise families, progress with hobbies and interests, such as, you know, sports and arts and crafts and so on, and search for meaning. Search for meaning. And we describe this, and this is the latest issue of our book, The Human Givens, which has sold huge numbers, over 150,000, I think, copies this book sold, which is not bad for a very serious book, but it's an easy book to read. So what are the signs to be aware of today? Are we in a rising or a falling stage? Well, when a group comes to share a particular view or belief not based on objective reality without properly appraising the evidence, we have what's known as groupthink. People will think things that just aren't true, and you'll see that in all kinds of things that have happened over the last few years. And because their shared view is essentially subjective, they need to go out of their way to insist it is so self-evidently right that a consensus of all right-minded people must agree with it, and any evidence that contradicts it can be disregarded. You see this in matters to do with the climate and the COVID pandemic and all the rest of it. You see the kind of the Brexit as another one. You see this groupthink. So what happens then is that people display an irrational, dismissive hostility towards anyone daring to question the groupthink. It's a long quote, but I'll read it out. As important a fact as any individual cause on earth is the virtual incapacity of human individuals to distinguish between a genuine cause and one which is foisted upon him or her by pressure from the environment, by propaganda or by conditioning. If people had the sense they pretend to have, they would seek the means to make this fundamental distinction perceptible. Hardly anyone makes this effort. This is partly because it is an invisible but powerful part of their culture to teach that conditioned emotionality and causes whose necessity, urgency or rightness is only conditioned into them are necessarily right. And then that's why you get things like, Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and these mad cults that have grown up. And there's more and more of them all the time. That's very worrying. You get crazy policies enacted. That's another sign. So we've got, the Equalities Act of 2010, for example, open borders, multiculturalism, net zero, crazy, crazy policies. A love of money starts to grow. It's been around a long time, of course, but it's growing more and more as people get desperate. Some enjoy a long period of wealth and power, but only some. Complacency sets in, and there's a loss of faith in hidden forces. If you think everything can be explained, as the left hemisphere does, by mechanical means, you're a lost soul, really. There are hidden forces. I mean, gravity is a hidden force, for example. You can assume it's there, but you can't see it. You get an increase in selfish behaviour and bad manners. There's another sign. There's a loss of a sense of duty that used to be around a lot in the past. But now, very few young people have got a sense of duty. You get signs of decadence, i.e. a surfeit of images designed to titillate appetites. Globalists appear, and this has always happened. Alexander the Great was a globalist. He wanted to conquer the world. Stalin wanted to conquer the world. You could go on listing all the great tyrants of the world. They wanted to conquer the world. But are globalists civilized? Well, it's an interesting quote, this. The move towards universalism favoured by globalist elites seems impossible to achieve. The kind of person required for universalism could not be more contrary to most of our present offering, devoted solely to themselves and indifferent to the destiny of fellow humans, still conditioned by territorial frontiers, racial prejudices, political trends and religious ideas that have always divided humanity. Professor Giovanna Di Garialdi. So, there's a massive increase in bureaucracy as civilizations collapse. It's always cosy in here. We're insulated by layers of bureaucracy. And that's true, isn't it? In the Gentleman's Book Club, we recently read a book about Adam Smith, and there's a quote from him: "There's no art which government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from the pockets of the people." That's what's happening now. That's what inflation is doing. It's stealing from us. And the nightmares, our tax code is 21,000 pages long and contains 10 million words and is 12 times the size of the complete works of Shakespeare. I mean, this is it just beggars belief, doesn't it? Well, it makes me quite cross. Tacitus, Roman historian, said the more numerous the laws, the more corrupt the state. And we certainly have a very corrupt state now, I think, and all the Western countries, but also Eastern countries, China and various other countries, India. This is a long quote from Edward T. Hall. He wrote a wonderful book called Beyond Culture. I just split up the quote into shorter sections, because I just think bureaucracy is what's draining the lifeblood out of our culture now. Of all of man's institutions, bureaucracy in all cultures has a tremendous potential to be counterproductive. This drive towards inefficiency may be a direct consequence of blind adherence to procedure, but it also stems from bureaucratic needs for self-preservation and a vulnerability to pressure groups. The combination is unbeatable. Established to serve mankind, the service function is soon forgotten, and bureaucratic functions and survival take over. By their very nature, bureaucracies have no conscience, no memory, and no mind. They are self-serving, amoral, and live forever. That's why they frustrate us all the time. You know, you want to get something done, you phone up, you can't get through to the right person. And they put you through to someone else and make you wait months for an appointment and all the rest of it. What could be more irrational? Changing them is almost impossible because they function according to their own rules and bow to no man, not even the President of the United States. Well, Edward T. Hall was an American, so that's why that's in there, but it applies to everybody. Custom, human frailty, and the will to power keep our bureaucracies going. When speaking of bureaucracies, I include big business, philanthropic and educational institutions, churches and government on all levels. Paradoxically, most bureaucracies are staffed largely with conscientious, committed people who are trying to do the right thing, but they're powerless or feel powerless to change anything. Some answer must be found to bureaucracy. It is not social injustice capitalised upon by political leaders that causes revolutions. It is when bureaucracies become so top-heavy and inefficient that they are incapable of serving the needs of the people that come, and that's when governments fall. So organisational rigidity, which reduces the energy, initiative and enterprise of individuals. That's the lack of initiative and enterprise and resilience is a huge problem now for us. But you know, we're comfortable in Sibford Gower, we don't think about it, but it's true. You get the age of intellect and universities starting up, and then some of the people have got all this money, they start a welfare state because it's something in them says we've got to help people, which isn't a bad thing to have, but the moment you do that, you stop people needing to struggle, and you actually need to struggle to get anywhere. Intensification of internal political conflicts, well, we don't have that in this country, do we? Increase in androgynous behaviour. Roger Scruton pointed this out. He said that when civilisations go down, people get more and more confused about their sex and their sexual orientation. And at the moment, we've got all this trans stuff as well going on. It's not to say that there's something wrong with trans people. They are people, and just as homosexuals and lesbians are people. But you get an increase in that behaviour at the end of Civilisations, and he's not the only person to say that. You get a weakening of religion, and you get a growth of pessimism and nihilism, and the uglification of the world, as in much modern architecture. It's really quite disturbing when you go into a lovely old town and the centre's been ripped out and all these horrible square concrete and glass buildings are put into place. So I'm just going to read a quote which sums up how I feel about the world today. And it comes from this chap. And it's slightly too long to put on a slide. But eventually, if you realise what I've just been saying, if any of that rings true with you, you might be up for realising that society is in crisis. And this, he says, applies to all the civilisations as they go downhill. What used to work no longer does. Institutions and infrastructures have broken down. Bureaucracy strangles society in red tape. Rent-seeking insiders batten on the public purse, and selfish elites feather their own nests. The gap separating rich and poor becomes a chasm. As problems multiply and become chronic, overloaded leaders struggle to cope. Addressing one problem creates new ones. Not addressing small problems turn them into big ones. The elite is divided by interest or ideology into fractions, so politics is gridlocked or even fratricidal. Mental health declines. There is increasing frustration, tension, division, disorder and distress, so every form of irrationality flourishes. In the end, the social contract unravels. the populace and even members of the elite lose all faith in the system and in their leaders, who are seen as ineffective at best, incompetent and corrupt at worst. So that was from this little book, Immoderate Grossness. And I won't go into all this, but he says these are the main reasons for this being a problem. Ecological exhaustion, exponential growth, expedited entropy, excessive complexity, moral decay, and practical failures. And I think that's about my last slide. The world is a fashioning instrument for polishing humankind. We have nothing to lose by assuming that there is an urgent undertaking in life that bears a relationship with our post-mortem state. We don't, you can believe in spiritual ideas or not, it doesn't matter, but we've nothing to lose by thinking there might be something in it. So, there's me standing at the top of the hill, at the end of the lane, and that's it. That can be answered in many different ways, that question. So that's me for this evening. If anyone wants to talk about any of these things, they're welcome to email me. Thank you very much. Yes, it's the givens of human nature. We all come into the world with innate physical and emotional needs. These are given to us. So it's about needs, basically, that every human being has. And I sort of quickly went through them, but the book we've written is all about those needs and how when people don't get their needs met, that's when they start to get anxious and then perhaps, if they worry a lot, depressed. And if they might get angry as well, which is a very left brain way of dealing with things. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Ivan, the very first images that you showed with the obelisk, what you called the obelisk, where was that?
Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Turkey.
Yes. You can go and visit it now. They've built they're making money out of it now, bringing in tourists. But it's fascinating. I mean, I didn't know about it. It was only sort of discovered about 40 years or so ago. It was a mountain or hill, and then they went in to excavate it, and they started finding all these obelisks and things, these T-shaped obelisks. Is obelisk the right word? I think it must be. And all the carvings on them and so on. And at first they thought, well, this is strange because at that time there's only supposed to be hunter-gatherers. But now they think there was more than that round there. There was early agriculture and so on. And there's lots of them in Turkey. They now realise that there's not just one or two. There's 30 or 40 hills with these kind of structures underneath them. And they're 6,000 or 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, which we're thrilled with, but it's only a few thousand years old. And yes.
One question about him. Ivan, thank you, first of all, and two questions, really. The first is that this is a law of the universe that we must decline, as you've suggested, and it does make sense to me that it is so. So how do we best ride that decline? So when we are on a downslide, and we become aware of it, which is part of the purpose of your presentation, what is the best way to respond to that?
Well, you can have you can put a veil over it and not think about it and look at it, or you can get knowledgeable enough so that you can take actions to try and make sure that you and your family continue. I mean, just when a civilization ends, mankind doesn't disappear, but new civilizations have to grow, and they can take generations. But it can take a long time for a civilization to develop, but it can go in a couple of years almost. It can happen very quickly. It can happen very quickly, as it did, for example, in as I was saying, about the old kingdom of Egypt. And for about 100 years, suddenly the Nile dries up. And what do? Because that's where all their growth came from. And that was down to climate change, essentially. You know, when it gets colder, everything goes wrong. You know, at the moment we've got climate change, and everyone's going on about we've got to harvest carbon trading, do carbon trading, you know. But actually, without CO2, we'd all be dead. It's absolutely essential. Since the Chinese and the Indians and others have been putting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, the world in 20-odd years is 15% greener, according to the satellites, because they take photographs of how the greenery is spreading. I mean, that's a massive change in 20, 25 years. And that's because there's more CO2. And yet an awful lot of ignorant politicians and school teachers teaching this in schools, fighting the lives out of children, saying, you know, we've got to get rid of it. We've got to get rid of CO2. It's not a poison. It's absolutely essential for the life of plants. And without plants, you don't have any animals or insects. I don't know if that answers your question there, John.
It does.
Oh, good. You said you had two questions.
Yes, I have another one.
Oh, dear.
If others, it's fine.
No, carry on.
Yeah. So ancient Egypt seems to me a bit of a mystery because, yes, I mean, there's the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, but at the same time there was an incredible amount of continuity in at least the art and the architecture. So is that a civilization that somehow...
Well, the thing is, people don't, you know, when things get difficult, not everybody dies. Knowledge is retained in some of the people. And that knowledge was then quickly used to develop the Middle and the New Kingdoms, the other kingdoms that followed from the Old Kingdom. That's what I think. But I mean, I'm not an expert on ancient Egypt.
John has one at the back there.
Ivan, thanks very much. Really appreciate the efforts you put into this. Can I just ask, this might be going off at a slight tangent, but the whole question of autistic people, I was interested in relation to Ian McGilchrist's work and his brain. So it's a long way of asking, are autistic people part of the solution or part of the problem in the ending of civilization as we know it, or both?
Well, some people have said, that without a touch of autism, you wouldn't have had creativity and you wouldn't have had craftsmanship. For example, there's graves have been opened up in Russia which have thousands of little beads wrapped around the skeletons. The clothing has disappeared, and these are sort of 30, 40,000 years old. But each bead has been carefully drilled somehow. Who but an autistic person, it's like the sort of person that would create, you know, computer programs and all the rest of it, would have the patience to keep doing that, not just once or twice, but hundreds of times. And people around them who were not autistic would have admired that and thought that was really amazing. And an awful lot of creative people have autistic genes in them. A lot of painters, musicians, and so on have a touch of autism. So it's quite possible that we wouldn't have any civilizations without a touch of autism in people. And it's been around for such a long time. I think probably everyone in this room has got a touch of it. It'd be surprising if we didn't.
I was just thinking of a diagram where you had overlapping arcs of civilization. If you step back and look at the world at the moment, is it one civilization that's rising and falling, or are there signs of...
I think there's several.
Well,
But I just did that just to explain that it's not just one civilization getting up. We've got a strange world now because everything is so interconnected all over the world. Trade, the internet, and so on, and satellites whizzing about. So we've got a situation where there's chances of something dangerous happening. Well, we know this in the Middle East now. You know, I read an article in the paper today saying we could be sort of a week away from a nuclear war, for heaven's sake, you know. Which brings me back to my first book, which is all about, you know, why do we have nuclear weapons if we haven't made preparations to survive the effects of them for the general population? I mean, I think basically a better psychological understanding of human behaviour is a really healthy thing. Even Khaldun was doing that hundreds of years ago. And other people have been doing it, you know, going back further than that even into ancient Greece, and some people have always been interested in human behaviour, why we do the things we do, why do things go wrong, and why do sometimes things go right. But there's no recipe, unfortunately.
Would it be fair to say that a split between human aspirations and human behaviour and a regard for nature would be a cause on its own of the collapse of the
Yes, I think, I mean, at the moment, with all this madness about electric cars and so on, we've got some massive amount of mining going on all over the world, and some of it cruelly using child labour, and to get lithium and copper and all these other things that are needed for electric cars and electric anything, you know. It's a real problem. So that's not respecting or regarding nature. Destroying forests instead of looking after them in the ways that they used to be looked after by indigenous peoples, that's a problem too. And mass agricultural techniques are also a difficulty. You know, but then what do we want to be? Do we want to go back to being serfs with our little plot of land and our chickens and a couple of pigs? I don't think anybody really wants that. And why? You can't blame them. It's so easy to pop into Aldi or the Co-op or Waitrose now and just get what you want. You haven't had to toil out there in the rain and the wind and the hot sun to feed yourselves. So we've created this world that if we backed away from it, it's going to be, really, really difficult.
Well, on that positive note,
I'm sorry. I hope I haven't depressed you.
thank you very much, Alan.
That's all right. Thank you.